a 29-year-old man, never imagined that my life could take such a twisted turn. Just 2 months ago, I finalized my divorce from my ex-wife, whom I loved deeply. She was 27, and we had been married for nearly 2 years. Our relationship, however, began crumbling when I uncovered a secret that left me shattered beyond repair. She had been cheating on me with my childhood friend, a person I once considered a brother. But let me start from the beginning. I grew up in a family where I always felt like the outsider, the black sheep. My childhood friend, let's call him Mark, had been a part of my life since I was 5. We grew up together, and he was like the sibling I never had, though in hindsight I wished he had never entered my life. My parents adored him as if he was their own son. In contrast, I always felt like I was just another member of the household, not truly valued. Even in my teenage years, Mark always overshadowed me. He was the golden boy, charming, well-liked by everyone, and naturally gifted. Whatever I achieved, it paled in comparison to what Mark did. When I turned 18, I made the decision to leave home and pursue a life on my own terms. My family didn't seem too concerned. They were too busy praising Mark for his latest accomplishment. That was when I realized they'd never truly appreciated me for who I was. I distanced myself from them, worked hard to get through college by taking out loans and working part-time jobs. My life wasn't easy, but at least I was free from the constant comparison. Mark and I stayed in touch sporadically, but the bond we had as children had weakened over time. I thought I had finally moved on from that chapter of my life. Let's call her Emily. Emily and I met through mutual friends, and from the moment I saw her, I was smitten. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had a sense of humor that drew me in like no one else. We started dating, and within a year I proposed. Life was perfect, or at least I thought it was. But life has a way of pulling the rug from under your feet when you least expect it. Emily and I were married for 2 blissful years, or so I thought. I had no idea that behind my back, she was rekindling a relationship with Mark, my former best friend, and my family's golden child. It was like my worst nightmares had come true, and they did in the most horrific way possible. About 4 months ago, Emily came to me with what I thought was the happiest news I had ever heard. She told me she was pregnant. I was over the moon. For years I had dreamed of becoming a father, of building a family that was better than the one I had grown up in. But slowly, things started to feel off. Mark, who had re-entered my life after years of distance, began visiting more often. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was, after all, still someone I had once considered a close friend. Then things started getting strange. I began noticing how Mark would hover around Emily, how he'd touch her pregnant belly in a way that made me uncomfortable. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a weird quirk, maybe him being overly affectionate. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake off the suspicion. One night, as Emily slept next to me, I couldn't take the unease anymore. I picked up her phone, something I had never done before, and went through her messages. My heart sank as I read the text between her and Mark. They had been having an affair for months, and what's worse, the baby she was carrying wasn't mine. It was his. I confronted Emily the next morning. At first, she tried to deny everything, but she eventually broke down and confessed. She had been seeing Mark behind my back, and they had planned to tell me the truth only after the baby was born. They had wanted to manipulate me into paying child support for a child that wasn't even mine. The betrayal was overwhelming. Not only had I lost the woman I loved, but I felt as if I had lost everything I had ever trusted. My marriage was built on lies, and I couldn't bear to face the reality of it all. I filed for divorce immediately. But as if the situation wasn't bad enough, my family, who had always treated me like I was second best, sided with Mark and Emily. My parents, who had always favored Mark, couldn't even acknowledge how much he had wronged me. To them, it was as if my pain didn't matter. They tried to convince me that I should be happy for Mark and Emily, that they had found true happiness, and I should support them. It was as though the years of being overlooked and undervalued had all led to this moment of ultimate betrayal. After the divorce, I cut off all contact with my family. It was clear to me that they never truly cared about me. They only cared about keeping Mark happy, even if it meant breaking my heart in the process. Emily walked away with a significant settlement, thanks to my family backing her claims that I had been controlling and toxic throughout our marriage. She even took my car, leaving me with little more than the clothes on my back. The only thing I had left was the house, but it felt empty and cold, a reminder of the life I thought I had built, now in ruins. Despite everything, I threw myself into work, determined to rebuild my life. I refused to let them see me broken. 2 weeks ago, I was promoted at work. It was a huge achievement. Better salary, better position, and even a company car. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud of myself. I decided to celebrate with a solo dinner at one of my favorite restaurants, and I made the mistake of posting about it online. That's when everything took another unexpected turn. Within days, my mother contacted me. I hadn't spoken to her or anyone in my family since the divorce, but suddenly she was calling me, asking to meet. I ignored her calls at first, but she persisted. She even showed up at my workplace, creating a scene. I had no choice but to agree to visit her and my father. When I arrived, it became clear what they wanted. Mark had lost his job, and the settlement money from the divorce wasn't enough to support them, my ex-wife and their newborn child. They wanted my help. My parents, who had sided with my ex and Mark throughout the entire ordeal, now had the audacity to ask me for financial support. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they had done to me, betraying me, choosing Mark over me, they now expected me to swoop in and rescue them. The shock left me speechless for a moment, but then I realized I didn't owe them anything. I walked out of the house without saying a word. As I was leaving, I ran into Mark outside. He looked surprised to see me, but that didn't stop him from begging for help. He asked if I could lend him money just until he got back on his feet. That's when I lost it. I told him to fend for himself, that he could beg in the streets if he had to, but I was done supporting people who had only ever torn me down. Since that day, my mother hasn't stopped texting me. She keeps trying to make me feel guilty, telling me that family is family and that I should help them. But after everything they've done, how could I? I've spent years being used and overlooked, and now that I'm finally doing well, they want to take advantage of my success. It's been a constant battle between guilt and anger. Part of me wants to help because deep down, they are still my family. But the other part of me knows that they don't deserve my help. They only want me in their lives now because of what I can offer them financially. The truth is, I feel used, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to forgive them for that. As I drove away from my parents' house that day, rain pouring heavily outside, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, and something that resembled sadness. For so long, I had yearned for acceptance from my family. I had spent years hoping they would one day see me as more than just the other son. Yet here I was, walking away from them, knowing full well they were only reaching out because of my success. I parked my car a few blocks away and just sat there, staring out into the storm. I wondered how everything had come to this, how a life that once seemed full of promise had turned into a series of betrayals. It felt like I was living someone else's nightmare, but the pain was very real. I had lost not just my wife, but also the possibility of fatherhood. In a way, I had even lost my identity. Emily's pregnancy, the one that I once believed was a sign of new beginnings, was now just another reminder of how blind I had been. I couldn't shake the image of Mark touching her belly, pretending to be just a concerned friend while hiding his affair. The thought of them together, planning a life at my expense, made my blood boil. How could they have been so cruel, so calculating? I replayed the confrontation with Mark in my head. His smug face when he saw me leave my parents' house still haunted me. He always had a way of getting what he wanted, whether it was my parents' affection, Emily's love, or even now, the audacity to ask for my help. But I knew deep down that Mark's arrogance was just a facade. The reality was that he needed me now, more than ever. He had lost his job, and with a newborn baby in the picture, his life wasn't as glamorous as he had once imagined. For years, I had been the one to suffer in silence, to push through every obstacle on my own. Now, for the first time, Mark was the one struggling. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't owe him or my family anything. They had chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. No amount of guilt-tripping or emotional manipulation could change that. As the days passed, my mother's texts continued. She kept pleading with me, trying to appeal to my sense of familial duty. "We're still your family," she wrote. "Mark made mistakes, but he's still your brother. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive him?" Each message felt like a punch to the gut. How could she not see the damage they had done? How could she so easily dismiss the betrayal, as if it were a minor misunderstanding? I couldn't bring myself to respond to her. Every time I thought about replying, my mind raced back to the day I found out about Emily's affair. The texts I had read on her phone, the way they had laughed behind my back, mocking my trust, played in my mind over and over. There was no forgiveness for what they had done. I knew that if I gave in, if I helped them, I would only be opening the door for more pain. Still, the guilt lingered. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being heartless? Was I letting my anger cloud my judgment? There were moments, late at night, when I wondered if I would regret my decision. But then I would remind myself of the facts. They had lied, they had betrayed me, and they had chosen to support Mark and Emily over me at every turn. The breaking point came when Mark showed up at my door unannounced one evening. It had been raining heavily all day, and I was not in the mood for another confrontation. I opened the door to find him standing there, drenched and looking more desperate than I had ever seen him. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and strained. I stood there for a moment, considering whether to let him in. But then I remembered how he had stood by and let Emily deceive me, how he had been complicit in every lie. I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in, but I didn't offer him a seat. This wasn't a social visit. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Fear. "I know I messed up, okay? I know what I did was wrong, but I'm in a really bad place right now. I need your help, just for a little while. I'm trying to get a job, but things are tough. With the baby and everything, I don't know what to do." It was the first time I had ever heard Mark admit that he was struggling. For years, he had been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. Seeing him like this felt surreal, but as much as I wanted to feel sympathy, I couldn't forget the hurt he had caused. "You think you can just waltz back into my life and ask for help?" I said, my voice rising. "After everything you did? You and Emily planned this, Mark. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you didn't care about how it would affect me. And now you want my help?" He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't think it would get this bad," he muttered. "I didn't know she was going to leave you like that." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't know? Mark, you were part of the plan. Don't pretend like you were some innocent bystander. You both lied to me, cheated, and then tried to trap me into paying for a child that wasn't even mine. And now, because things didn't go the way you wanted, you come to me for a bailout? You're unbelievable." Mark's face twisted in frustration. "You don't get it, do you? I'm still your brother. Family should help each other out no matter what. I made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you get to abandon me." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Family. He dared to use that word after everything that had happened, after everything he had taken from me. "You're not my brother," I said coldly. "Not anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stood there, stunned, as if he hadn't expected me to say those words. But they were true. Whatever bond we had shared as kids was long gone, shattered by his betrayal. Without another word, I walked to the door and opened it. "Leave," I said firmly, "and don't come back." Mark hesitated for a moment, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. But he knew there was nothing left to say. He walked out into the rain, and I closed the door behind him, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my life again. I had cut ties with the people who had only brought me pain, and I wasn't going to let them drag me down any longer. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, made new friends, and started finding joy in the small things again. The guilt that had once plagued me began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. I had done what was right for me, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, my mother stopped texting. The calls from my family ceased. They had realized that I wasn't going to come to their rescue, and they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't the outcome they had hoped for, but it was the one they deserved. As for Mark and Emily, I heard through the grapevine that they were struggling. Mark still hadn't found a job, and the financial strain was starting to take its toll on their relationship. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part of me just felt sorry for them. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. In the months that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Cutting my family out of my life hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. There was a strange freedom that came with knowing I no longer had to live up to their expectations or deal with the constant comparisons to Mark. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally standing on my own 2 feet without the weight of their judgment hanging over me. Work became my sanctuary. I poured all my energy into my job, determined to excel in every way possible. My promotion had brought me a new sense of purpose, and with it, the respect and recognition I had always craved. My colleagues noticed the change in me too. I was no longer the quiet, reserved guy in the office who kept to himself. I had become more confident, more assertive, and people were starting to take notice. But as much as I tried to move on, there were moments when the pain of the past would resurface. I would find myself lying awake at night, thinking about Emily, about the life we had once planned together. There were times when I couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. Was there something I had missed? A sign that things were falling apart before it all came crashing down? It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me. It was the feeling of loss. I had lost more than just a wife. I had lost the future I had envisioned for myself. The idea of being a father, of raising a child in a loving home, was something I had cherished deeply. Even though I knew the baby wasn't mine, the pain of losing that dream still stung. I tried dating again, but it wasn't easy. Every time I met someone new, I found myself comparing them to Emily. It wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't fair to me either. I knew I needed time to heal, to fully move on from the wreckage of my marriage before I could even think about building something new. But that didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Friends tried to support me through it all, but even they didn't fully understand the depth of my hurt. How could they? None of them had been betrayed by the 2 people they trusted most in the world. None of them had experienced the feeling of having their entire life ripped apart overnight. I appreciated their efforts, but there were times when I just wanted to be left alone with my thoughts. One day, while scrolling through social media, I came across a photo of Mark and Emily. They were at some family gathering, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. My parents were in the background, holding the baby, Mark's baby. The sight of them all together, happy and united, sent a wave of anger coursing through me. It was as if they had all moved on, completely unaffected by the devastation they had caused in my life. For a moment, I felt the urge to lash out. I wanted to comment on the photo, to expose them for what they had done, to let the world see the truth. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only make me look bitter and petty, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they still had that kind of power over me. Instead, I logged off and threw my phone aside. I couldn't let them get to me. Not anymore. I began seeing a therapist around this time, realizing that I needed professional help to truly heal from everything. Talking about the betrayal, about my family's neglect, and about the deep-seated wounds from my childhood wasn't easy. There were sessions where I barely spoke at all, too overwhelmed by the emotions I had bottled up for years. But slowly, things started to change. I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to my family's approval or to Emily's love. I started to see that I had spent so much of my life seeking validation from people who would never give it to me. And that wasn't my fault. It was theirs. Therapy also helped me recognize patterns in my relationships. I had a tendency to put others' needs before my own, to bend over backward to keep people happy, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. With Emily, I had ignored the red flags because I so desperately wanted to believe that our love was real. I had convinced myself that everything would work out, even when the signs pointed otherwise. It was a hard pill to swallow, realizing how much of myself I had lost in the process of trying to make others happy. But it was also liberating. For the first time in a long while, I started focusing on myself, my needs, my dreams, and my happiness. As I continued to rebuild my life, I began exploring new hobbies. I took up running, something I had never really enjoyed before, but it became a way for me to clear my mind and let go of the stress. I also started volunteering at a local animal shelter. There was something incredibly healing about spending time with the animals, many of whom had been abandoned or mistreated, much like I felt I had been. Through volunteering, I met new people who had no connection to my past. They didn't know about my messy divorce, my strained relationship with my family, or the pain I had been carrying for so long. To them, I was just another volunteer, someone who cared about making a difference. It was refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was building a life that wasn't defined by my past. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. I received an email from an old college friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She had heard about my divorce through mutual friends and wanted to check in on me. At first, I was hesitant to respond. I wasn't sure if I was ready to reconnect with people who knew the old me, the me who had been married to Emily, the me who had been betrayed. But something about her message was comforting. She wasn't prying or offering unsolicited advice. She was simply reaching out to see how I was doing. "So," I replied, and before I knew it, we were catching up over coffee. It was during one of our conversations that I realized something important. Life doesn't always go according to plan, and that's okay. The future I had once envisioned was gone, but that didn't mean I couldn't create a new one. I didn't have to let the past define me or hold me back. I could start over, on my own terms. As weeks turned into months, I found myself feeling lighter, freer. The bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. I wasn't fully healed, not yet, but I was getting there. Slowly but surely, I was reclaiming my life. Mark and Emily were still out there, living their lives. My family continued to exist in their bubble, pretending that nothing had ever happened. But their actions no longer held power over me. I had let go of the need for their approval, for their love, for their validation. I was enough, just as I was. Looking back, I realized that the betrayal had, in a way, been a blessing. It had forced me to confront the parts of myself that I had been ignoring for years. It had shown me who truly cared about me and who didn't. And most importantly, it had given me the strength to stand on my own without relying on anyone else for my happiness. I'm still a work in progress, but aren't we all?